With recent geopolitical shocks driving renewed interest in nuclear power for firm, low-carbon electricity, demand for reactor fuel is rising fast. And today we're asking Dustin Garrow, a leading expert on uranium and nuclear energy, whether the market can keep up. Hi, Dustin. So nice to see you again.
Yeah, it is. It's been a little while, but nice to get back in contact because a lot going on these days.
So you must
Lot
be
to
a
talk
busy
about.
man now because everybody's talking about nuclear, uranium, and nuclear fuel.
Yes, and again, I just returned from a couple of big investor conferences, Bank of America and Canaccord that was in Las Vegas. And then there was a big fuel conference here in Arizona. And part of it had to do with the discussions now is uranium availability as we see escalating nuclear demand coming. Is the fuel side of that going to be able to, as you say, keep up with the demand? And that's kind of the big question now, is how quickly can the fuel cycle expand to support that? So,
Well, can we talk about this World Nuclear Fuel Market meeting in Arizona? What's your big takeaway from that?
um, the big takeaway again was, from the podium, several comments about in the fuel area, it had been very focused on conversion services and enrichment, which is further, they say, downstream in the fuel cycle, which came out of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because the Russians were a fairly significant supplier of nuclear fuel to the U.S., more than 25%, as well as into the EU. And so as we've gone now, we're 4 years into that. We've got a total ban coming in the United States starting in 2028 on Russian fuel. The EU is looking at finally banning the Russians. So what it did was it put significant pressure on the West. And so this is part of the fuel cycle that, was being, let's say, struggling because the Russian supply was lower cost. And, they, in fact, before the invasion, they said publicly they wanted up to 40% of the US market. So they were going to be coming even in a bigger role. So that obviously changed. We now have a bifurcated market, as it's called. And so through the fuel cycle, the Western suppliers now have to make investments which really depend on the demand. They're really being very clear that when they can get support, be it from the utilities, be it from the hyperscale data center demand that's looming, then they'll move forward. But the big talk was uranium availability, which for years was kind of, well, there's plenty of uranium. And now with the market bifurcation and the demand on the horizon, it's becoming a bigger and bigger issue of where that uranium will be coming from. And so there's a big pressure. So that'll affect prices. It's just, again, the whole idea of the security of the nuclear program from a commercial standpoint is driven by the fuel. I mean, the Director General of the World Nuclear Association made the observation that without enough fuel, we can't build all of these proposed reactors. So I think, coming out of the conference, that was really the takeaway, is how quickly can the industry respond globally? I mean, be it Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Canada, Australia, it's a global sector, and how quickly can it respond? So we're entering a very interesting period, let's put it, which I hadn't seen before. I know in my many decades in the industry. So very exciting.
Well, at the end of last year, you talked about a demand shock building in the industry from where you sit now. Is that happening?
Well, it's kind of interesting. It's like as almost everywhere you look. I mean, again, the WNA study that came out in September, I think was a real shock to the system because they showed significant gaps in supply based on the demand. Three cases. But you step back and look at the demand and its utilities. It's hard to find a country that is not expressing interest in nuclear in some way. And Italy. I mean, years and years ago, they had a program after Chernobyl. They shut it down, and now they just said by this summer they should have a program for SMR development. And Taiwan, they just shut down their last reactor, and almost immediately legislation was proposed to restart those units. And here in the U.S., I mean, we have some restart reactors in reaction to the data center demand. Never would we have thought that this was going to happen. Again, I was talking to a utility representative this week, and they said, one reactor has been shut for 5.5 years. And so they're going to go back in, refurbish, and bring it back on. Never thought that was going to happen. So we've got the reactor restarts. We have new construction. One comment that was made by a longtime industry consultant was, right now we've got about 400 gigawatts of nuclear worldwide. And his comment was, with the existing fleet, they're going to start expanding capacity because you can upgrade a reactor incrementally. The units that are under construction, that by 2032, which isn't that far off, we'd likely be at 500 gigawatts. So a 25% increase in just that short period without the SMR effect and things like that. So, I mean, we're starting to see it even with the existing, China's got 30-some reactors under construction, and they're not letting up. I mean, they are still ordering that 8 to 10 reactors a year. And again, we could spend quite a bit of time on the hyperscale data centers, but being here in Arizona, they're everywhere. Travel around the U.S., you see the big facilities, no windows, no signage, and you go, well, that's a data center. And so obviously they need power. So they're looking at short-term gas turbines, but virtually all of them want because these are going to operate long-term. This isn't just a short-term phenomenon, then they'll kind of go. They want small modular reactors. They want to be producing their own power on site and get off the grid because of, it needs to be overhauled. I mean, not a lot of capital has gone in it. But, just as an example, just like I said, we could spend a lot of time. Meta, they have a huge campus now, they're calling them. In Louisiana, the budget is $500 billion, which seems to be, you can't. And Zuckerberg is committed $200 billion to it. So, I mean, that's the kind of capital where, I mean, it's like numbers governments didn't have in their, total budgets. So again, that's going to be a future draw on the nuclear fuel cycle. They are beginning discussions to get involved in the fuel cycle. So I think we could see fundamental changes in how fuel is procured, the ownership. A lot of SOEs are out looking for fuel. It's not just individual private companies, but the Indians are now looking because they have a new program that's, going to order of magnitude more nuclear by 2047, up to 100 gigawatts. But it's China, South Korea, the Middle East is starting to show interest. So it's not just, again, small companies, it's governments. So it just, again, we've never seen this before. And some people are trying to forecast, okay, well, what's this mean? I don't know how you forecast this because there's just so many variables now coming into play, all positive. I mean, and I never thought we would see this. And it just is being characterized as nuclear future shock, accelerating change in a decreasing time frame. So it's not just a nice gradual uptick. It's just coming from all sides. So that, I mean, the conferences, the next one will be London in September. And, I expect this will all be on the agenda.
So with small modular reactors, you said, everybody wants them now because it would be easy. You can put it where the data center is. So, there was a stage when people said, well, it's not proven. Has that passed?
Well, at one point there were like 70 technologies, of course. The market is starting to kind of settle that out. And what we're seeing is because of the accelerated time frame, particularly for the data centers, it's the technologies that use conventional fuel. They don't need high assay, low enriched, which will come in time. Urenco, the big enrichment supplier, has said, yes, we're expanding. The one they just announced on Monday will be in operation in like 31, so it's a bit down the road. But there's, Westinghouse, General Electric, Rolls-Royce, they use conventional fuel. So I think they will be at the head of the queue. And where are we with SMRs? Okay, so China has a prototype, the Russians have a prototype operating. And in Canada, Darlington is under construction, and it'll be the first commercial unit. And they're saying 2030. But I think what you'll see is if the old nth of a kind, once that supply chain is set up, it's being put in place, and we get more and more of the units, you're going to start to see them penetrate. The big thing too, and I always want to mention, is Africa. I mean, as you know, there's a couple of reactors in South Africa, been there forever. For a while, they were looking at big reactors in like Nigeria. It would have fried the grid. So it just didn't make sense. But the advent of the SMRs, there was just a big conference in Rwanda, and all the African nations were there. In fact, some of the presidents were there. And they said, hey, we need to move forward on electrification, and SMRs fit the bill perfectly. Kenya announced they were in advanced negotiations with the U.S. on a 123 agreement, which is the peaceful use, which you have to kind of put in place. So what happens when the African continent says, we're ready? I think the capital will be there. So how fast can that happen? So, I mean, again, it's spread everywhere. And the SMRs, it's like Italy coming back. They had big units. Now they're saying, oh, everything will be SMRs. They're small. We can place them more easily, and, more construction in a factory. So it's a whole different technology, up to 300 megawatts as opposed to 1,000 or bigger. So it's quicker, it's less capital. So it's just unbelievable. And just quickly on the data centers, Blue Energy and General Electric just announced a strategy for data centers where they'll put in a gas turbine to start, but all of the nuclear related infrastructure will be put in. And so when the SMR is ready, you can't just plug it in. That's a little simplification. And, one is under construction here at Kemmerer, Wyoming. The Gates Group is building TerraPower, and they just got their certification from the US NRC. And that's another thing. Under the Trump administration, they are improving the regulatory regime for reactor certification for the fuel cycle. Uranium mines, you're getting permits a lot quicker. They're providing significant capital. The 10 reactor program that the president wants under construction by 2030 will that happen? Well, they're stepping up with $80 billion to help support that. We never saw that. And so, I mean, it's just, like I said, everything is changing for the good. And the problem is, how do you kind of get your, as they would say, put your head around it on where this is all going? It's just, and the International Energy Agency has come out and said, this is the age of electricity. And so now, I just read this morning, they expect demand for electricity to grow 6 times what the total energy demand growth will be between now and 2035. And it's electric vehicles, it's air conditioning, it's data centers, it's security of energy supply, So it's just unbelievable. Now, will it all happen? Of course, we've got the skeptics. Well, blah. But we are really moving rapidly in the right direction. It's just really, like I said, it's almost overwhelming when you think about it. So,
can we talk about mining? So I think you said the last time that new mines are essential. So are any projects moving forward? What's happening on the mining front?
It progressed in phases. After the invasion, the next phase was restarts. So we had a number of mines. MacArthur River in Canada, Cameco had shut it down, put it in care and maintenance. But then we had Langer Heinrich in Namibia, Kalakira in Malawi, several mines in the U.S. And they've now gone through the process of restarting. Some of them, it hasn't gone over smoothly, but they're working on it. But now it's widely recognized you have to have greenfields mines. You have to have new mines built. And that's where we're kind of right in the early days. Now, having said that, Denison in Canada just got their final permits, and they've initiated construction on their Phoenix in situ recovery mine in the Athabasca Basin, which they expect to have first production in 28 because it is in situ. So they drill well fields and inject into the deposit rather than a traditional mine of, let's say, blowing up the ore and all of that. And they expect to produce, 9 million pounds a year to start, but we're still a couple of years off. And, it's a new technology in that area. Now, the big mine, of course, in Canada is owned by NextGen, and that's Rook 1. And that could produce as much as 29 million pounds a year, so it's very large. They just received their final permits, but haven't made a final investment decision yet. Again, the mine is so big, so complex, now they have to really sit down and go, okay, how do we move this forward? And that then starts to bring in the utilities at this point. Are they going to make those commitments for projects that don't exist yet? And, I had several meetings along that line earlier this week, and they're saying, well, if I commit to you and you don't develop on time, then I'm not going to get that material, and I may then have to come out in a less, even a more difficult market because, I'm very focused on the term market. And that price has gone from 80 late last year. It's now 95. And there are contracts rumored to be done in the low hundreds already. And somebody just, a knowledgeable industry observer, which we always like, said to incentivize enough greenfields projects, probably need $120 to $150 a pound on a sustained basis. In other words, utilities have to come in and say, okay, we're going to commit for 5, 8, 10 years so you can then get the financing, get the mine built. Because if it's a more conventional mine, you're probably looking at 3 to 4 years for it to come into operation once you start construction. So we're in a new phase of the uranium market driven by projects that may be engineered, may be permitted, but then it's like we've got to go out and start investing and moving dirt. And you have to have a lot of those. Some people say, oh, you bring on like a rook, 29 million pounds a year. The chief executive officer said, no, you need a number of these. Well, so then I'm always asked, well, then where are those? The Kazakhs, just to touch, they're the biggest producer, 65 million pounds, and they're going to expand, is what they're saying, into the 72 to 75 million pound range. But I just talked to one of their reps this week, and he said, they're getting to the point where they don't have a lot of uncommitted production because they just agreed to reactors from the Russians and the Chinese under their new nuclear policy. They signed big contracts with India. They've signed a contract with the Emirates. They're in Eastern Europe. So, they don't have an infinite amount of production going forward. So, the market is really, let's call it fragile on the upside right now. And it's likely to be that way for quite some time. And then quickly on the spot, what they call mobile inventory, that is just kind of in the system, has really been reduced significantly. UX came out in 22 and said, based upon their study, mobile excess inventory is, the era is over. And that's what I'm hearing is in the spot market, you can still transact, but you can't buy big tranches. If you want to, in the old days, the good old days, if you wanted 1 million pounds, sure, you could find it from some. Now you have to kind of cobble that together with raising prices. So the market in spot has changed. So, it's like I said, it's everywhere you look. It's the market structure. It's the available inventories. It's where's production going to come from? How fast will new reactors be ordered? Again, the good old days when you. So anyway, it is even in the short time between when we spoke before, so much has happened that it's just hard to summarize, I guess.
And for investors, it's always a long term when it comes to uranium or, when in one of these mines or for utilities, it's long term planning.
Yeah, it is. And it's interesting. I'm meeting with a number of investors, at the Bank of America and Canaccord. They've been in the business 8 to 10 years. They've seen the price go up and down, and they focus on the spot price. They realize the term market is much larger. It's really the more fundamental market, but what's the price today? And to some of them, you can see the enthusiasm is off a little bit. That was one of my takeaways from Miami and Las Vegas. And we asked the sponsors about that, and they said, well, they're looking at copper and other things. I mean, after, and it's like, well, we're now 10 years into this. Like when, but yeah, it's a long-term investment, but when it starts to turn, it will be a fairly big event. Speaking to like Trade Tech that publishes a weekly price, and the comment was it won't be 50 cents a month. You're going to see very rapid changes in the prices once it starts to go. And we're very close to that. I always say, well, today we're closer than we were yesterday. I mean, that's stating the obvious. But no, I think the whole industry is just in a different situation now than it was even a year ago. So it's sort of pretty interesting.
Well, if you can look ahead, say, to the early 2030s, so what's the single biggest thing that needs to happen to avoid a supply crunch?
Well, I think, I'm a confluence of events type. Now, you can have the black swans and all that, but I think it's the support from the demand side. Again, the suppliers have learned, and they don't want to repeat a situation they come in, they get short-term support, they build a mine, and then something happens, and the price weakens, and then you have to put that mine on care and maintenance and all that. So they've made it clear really almost since day one post-Russian invasion, the buyers need to come in with long-term, sustainably priced contracts for them to go out, and then they can get the financing. I think the capital is available, but the investors are still also a little cautious. They're not going to finance a lot of mines that are based on the spot market. That really has never been part of what happens in the industry. So it's that. And then, consolidation, like in the U.S., we have too many small producers because people, when you've gone through decades of, let's say, the downtime, you really have, then you want to start developing mines. It's not so easy to find experienced, particularly uranium miners. The other thing now that's being recognized which is the longer term, is grassroots exploration. A lot of these greenfields projects were found in the 70s and 80s. Well, that inventory is starting to get much smaller. And the other thing is the plants. For example, let's say Vogel 3 and 4, that were the high cost overrun, but the fuel director says they're going to operate till the end of the century. So he's got to start looking beyond 2050 for fuel, and nobody's out there with the Geiger counter and the geologists running around in Peru or whatever looking for more pounds. So we now have to have that reinvigorated, which will then affect how the market is in, say, the mid-30s. But yeah, we need that support from the demand side. Maybe it comes from the data centers. They may come in and say, okay, you need this capital. We need the output. Again, the electricity is an input to their process. And that now, quick comment on the data centers. I would talk to a longtime colleague yesterday, and he said, well, we had the Cold War, geopolitical and all that. We now have another Cold War, and it has to do with AI, the availability of that output, which again is, there's no, I'll sit back for a while and wait to see. It's no, you have to have it. There's no question, because it's going to be the future of the global economy, of security, you name it. I mean, I hate to say it, but I have a military background, and I know all the pilots hate the idea they're not going to be sitting in a fighter. And you go, no, that's all going to be AI eventually. So again, you've got to have all that. So it keeps getting back to the energy and principally electricity. How are you going to get all that? And so that is basically what's on the table now, is who will step up. And so that's why these conferences within the industry are so important, because that message is now getting out there that, yeah, this isn't just, there's some idea that, well, the price goes up and the supply automatically shows up. May not really be the case. You've got to have kind of more to the equation. Let's put it that way. But yeah, it's going to be, you can build conversion, enrichment, fabrication, that's manufacturing, but finding uranium, you got to dig it out of the ground, and that's going to be the challenge. So,
well, I spoke to you, I think it was the first time in 2024, and we were speaking about the West's desire for more independence from Russia. So how far have they moved away from being dependent on Russian supplies of nuclear fuel?
Well, most of them, talking to the U.S. utilities in particular that had the largest exposure because they'd done the least contracting, they're pretty well covered to 2030, 31. So they've done whatever was necessary. Some of them continue to take Russian deliveries under waivers. Some of them had flexibility under old Western contracts with like a Cameco. They'd give you 10, 15, 20. So they've filled in, they've bought some spot, they've done, so they're, they are distancing themselves, I think, pretty significantly. The Russians, have moved material through China into the U.S. I refer to it as the Chinese laundry, but that has limitations. So we're really looking kind of, let's say that 31, 32 time frame. I've been told if you're a utility and you need material in 29 or 30, pretty limited, because everybody's pretty well committed. But then if you get out far enough, we could see expansion. We could see, MacArthur River can go to 25 million pounds, and new mines. But that's gotta happen. And so that's kind of really at the, as they call it, the inflection point that the uranium sector is at right now. Like I said, it's really going to be an interesting challenge. And some of it, the senior management is coming in from other commodities. And uranium, love it or leave it, is got its own set of unique characteristics. So there's a little bit of hesitancy. The boards, have gone for decades of being just watch the budget. Let's try to keep what we have. And now it's like, we need $500 million to build a new mine. Now, Deep Yellow, I've done work for them. And, the Tumas project produced 3.6 million pounds a year, 500 million US in order to build that mine. And it's like ready to go, all engineered, permitted, you name it. But there's a little bit of hesitancy. We have to see even a better market. When does that happen? Who commits? When do they commit? So I think there'll be a number of projects that will be kind of right at that starting gate, but it will be what kind of prices are the utilities and hopefully the data centers are willing to pay. I mean, that's what it gets down to. So
always so fascinating to hear your insights from such an insider and somebody who knows it so well. And Dustin Garrow, thank you so much.
You're quite welcome anytime, and maybe later in the year we'll have to reconvene.